Yeah. Good afternoon. Um, I'd like to do a presentation um, as part of a chapter in the book where we're going to talk actually about shared collections, cooperatives, and consortia. Now, these are three different things which basically mean the sort of similar aspects for collection development in that while they are um, three different topics, they also operate together in that they provide information to sharing collections between libraries. And they do it in a different manner. So while we're talking about sharing things with libraries, we're also talking about different 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 organizations, if you will, where libraries share amongst each other for different topics besides just collections, but collections is all part and parcel of all of them. So let's get started. First of all, when you're thinking of shared collections, the first thing you almost have to always consider are multi-branch libraries. That is, multi-branch libraries in public libraries. More we're talking about public libraries, but it also could be multi-branches in academic libraries. There was a period of time in history where there were more branch libraries than there are in many institutions. I worked in a place where, as an academic, it had about 13 odd branches. Now is down to only 2. A lot of that has to do with changes in collections, particularly electronic collections. It's not as critical to have a branch library when much of the material is electronic. But when we're talking about multi-branch libraries, and specific in this example I'm bringing up, I'm talking about mostly public libraries. So as you think about this in terms of public libraries, consider it can also be in many academic libraries. In that multi-branch libraries share collections. In academic libraries, they tend to be collections in specific branches more than sharing collections from one library to another. That tends to be a public library program than it tends to be an academic program, even though it doesn't matter which one it is, but primarily we're talking public libraries. In that, you could have floating collections, or you could just simply share collections. A patron in one library can get material that's in a different branch library. They also share patrons. Patrons can check out from any of the libraries. That is fairly common in multi-branch systems. In some branch libraries, I know a patron's got a home library, which may be one specific branch of a public library. They may call that their home library. And the way this operates is that in ILS systems, a lot of times when you're placing a hold, it pulls up the home library before it pulls up any of the other libraries to choose from. It's just merely more of a designation as to how the ILS operates than almost anything else. Now, when it comes to selection, and the way selectors operate in multi-branch systems, they can be shared selectors. Each library has its own selector, and they operate with selector cooperation. In other words, they're sharing selectors, maybe collecting a particular field in all the branches. Like a history librarian collects history for all the branches. Could be a selector cooperation where selectors from all the branches all meet as one group to make some decisions as a group. And then in some public libraries, particularly, there's a single selector who collects for all the branches. A single person one library that I used to work at had, I did selection in nonfiction, but for fiction, they had two single selectors, really, and for the branches. In other words, there was an adult a selector who selected adult material, and there was a selector who selected youth material. And what would happen is that selector would look at all the branches and order something for each of the branches. One branch would get one thing, one branch might get another, so that the whole system had it. If it was a very popular book, let's say Harry Potter, in which case they might have many copies, and they might lease most of the copies, they would make sure that each branch had like 10 copies. Even though the copies shifted from library to library, depending on the holds, the selector would make sure that there were as many copies for each of the libraries as possible, or one library would have, the selector would say that this set of libraries might, based on their user population, might have this topic and this other topic for another library with a different user population in the sense of multi-branch public libraries. Single selectors are not common in academic libraries. Even in branch systems, it's shared selectors. Well, not shared selectors, excuse me, selector cooperation. Each branch library generally has a selector, and the selectors get together as a group meeting, and there is some selector cooperation, making sure that one library has something that another library doesn't really need, but together they have a strong cooperation of the selectors. So this is a multi-branch system that could be public, primarily thinking public, but it could also be academic. Academics have gotten away from branch systems, many of them, because of electronic materials. Multi-branch systems work better in public libraries where you have a population that is somewhat variant from branch to branch. Now, we talk about shared collections in terms of branch libraries. Let's talk about shared collections with different libraries. Libraries can share collections. For example, we talk about the Research Triangle, which is North Carolina State University, University of Carolina at Chapel Hill, and Duke. They're all in Raleigh, North Carolina. The selectors in these libraries select heavily for their own collection, but they also work jointly with each other to make sure the collections between all three libraries are usable. So the selectors at libraries will communicate like in Research Triangle, and they share collections. In other words, a user from North Carolina State University can easily go to University of North Carolina Chapel Hill and borrow materials. That is very common, actually. One is sharing collections. And sharing collections, not just Research Triangle, but any library groups might share collections. And what is important a lot of times is that when people buy things or weed things, they base it on the ownership of another library. It's not so much purchasing in public libraries as much as it is weeding. For example, a library might decide in the process of weeding, there might be a question about the weeding, whether or not you really want to weed a material, but you look at the ownership of another library and you determine that library is probably going to keep that material. So you could fairly safe in weeding it in your own collection, because you know that a more established library, in the sense of like a state library, is going to own the material and probably not weed it. There's some communication between purchasing, but especially between weeding, based on the ownership of another library. So libraries do share collections. They do, one library and another library. They can base purchasing and weeding based on the ownership of another library, specifically weeding. Selectors can communicate, but more importantly, there can be patrons who use different libraries with a single card. For example, in one area I know, a patron can use, at this one college, can also use the public library, of which in that area there are actually two public libraries, but a patron can take their library card that they use at one location and have it accepted at other locations. Now, in Michigan, there was and different libraries have different policies in the way they lend things, but in Michigan, there used to be a system called MichiCard, where a library could put a MichiCard, one MichiCard library could put a sticker on their card, and that patron could go to another MichiCard library and borrow materials. It was a situation where a patron from one library could go to another library, borrow something, but they had to return it back to the library from which they borrowed it. There was no communication between libraries other than borrowing. MichiCard ceased in 2013 and was more replaced by the use of a Michigan product called MEL, Michigan Electronic Library, which also allowed lending. It allowed lending between libraries in Michigan, but if the library chose to do it, a patron could go to a library, borrow something, and then return to their own library to have it sent back. Or they could return it to the library from which they borrowed it. But it allowed some lending, primarily borrowing from another library and returning it. Or, more importantly, the way MEL tends to operate is your library, you borrow it from your library, but the library borrows it from another library for your use. The thing about MEL is it's what's referred to as a patron-initiated loan, in that the patron requests the material from another library to be sent to their library. That's called patron-initiated lending. That is a little bit different than lending between specific libraries and interlibrary loan. Lending between libraries can occur with interlibrary loan specifically by the library borrowing a material from another library, having it shipped to their library for a patron to use. And then the patron returns it to the library, and the library sends it back to the other library. That is lending between specific libraries, which can happen in consortia, as I'll talk about a little bit later. But interlibrary loans are very common. There is almost always a process where you can go to a library, specifically in academic libraries, and borrow from another library. Now, academic libraries tend to borrow from other libraries with an interlibrary loan process. In a long time ago, when I first started using interlibrary loans, it was very slow. An interlibrary loan of something could take a couple of weeks or better. Today, with electronic materials, and particularly with libraries using copiers that can PDF, those loans have gone down to a couple days at best, and sometimes quicker. So, shared collections are talking about different methodologies by which libraries borrow from other libraries, or patrons who use different libraries can borrow from another library. Usually, patrons who borrow with a single card are borrowing from libraries in the same region, same very specific area. Lending between libraries and interlibrary loans can take place across the state or interstate. Interlibrary loans tend to be interstate. Now, let's talk about cooperatives. Cooperatives is a sub-collection of where libraries share services, not necessarily collections, although it can include collections. Originally, cooperatives started because OCLC, which is now OCLC Incorporated, but originally stood for Ohio College Library Consortium, now is just simply OCLC Incorporated. It's gone from a acronym to a single word. They required the use of cooperatives for libraries to use OCL services. They had to form a cooperative in an area because OCLC would only communicate with a cooperative with their contracts. And so at one point, it was cooperatives started in order to share OCLC products. It has gone beyond that. Not many libraries utilize a lot of the OCLC products anymore the way they used to, because originally OCLC developed cards for card catalogs, and later a lot of libraries did RetroCon through OCLC. So that has kind of changed from what the original intent of a cooperative was. So now cooperatives operate to develop contracts for shared libraries. That was one of the original ones. Now they offer programs like services like various educational programs. They develop some shared state programs, statewide programs, and they share training and experts. For example, if you needed to learn about RDA or different types of cataloging information, the cooperatives offer educational programs. They can be either educational programs where you meet and get together, particularly before the COVID, but they also did a lot of programs that were web-based for a long time. Libraries tend to join membership into cooperatives, and while it was required with OCLC, now it tends to be more optional. However, a lot of the programs and the services that the cooperatives offer have different rates depending on if the library is a member of the cooperative or the library is not a member of the cooperative. If the library is a member of the cooperative, they tend to get better rates than a person who is in a library that is not a member of the cooperative. So cooperatives are some ways that libraries can share products, and they tend to be either public libraries but especially academic libraries can be members of cooperatives. Now, the other aspect of cooperatives, not specifically for public libraries, is what's known as a consortium or a consortia. What a consortia is it's a group of public libraries. Generally, academic libraries are not members of consortia as a rule. They're public libraries. And the way they operate is the libraries themselves oversee the meetings. There is a cooperative director, a consortia director, but the meetings tend to be run by the libraries themselves. The board of the consortia can be, each library can have, some of the libraries can have members that are on the board of the consortia, the governing board. But in some states, like in Michigan, the person who's on the governing board, while they represent a library, they cannot be a library employee. They have to be a board member or a friend of the library, but somebody who is not currently a library employee. The library I used to run, the previous library director, who had retired, became on the governing board because he was familiar with the consortia, having been a library director. But after he was no longer a library director and he was just unemployed, retired, he could be a governing board member. Whereas the board meetings tend to be the libraries and tend to be run by the libraries. But the consortia is a group of public libraries. Now, in some states, there are laws restricting how consortia are formed and how libraries have to join. Like in my state, libraries public libraries have to be a member of a consortia by state law. And the way the consortia is funded in some states is based on state aid. Each library receives state aid based on the number of the population of the library. And a large population gets more funding than a smaller population. And the funding comes usually from the state itself and is distributed by the state library. The way my state operates, half the funding that goes to the library for state aid goes to pay the consortia. By law, half the funding from state aid goes to pay the consortia. Consortia help libraries in quite a few ways. Primarily, they help with assistance with grants. They do best practices. They create library visibility, particularly for representation, say, to the state, for state representatives saying the library is very important to the library, try to make themselves visible as a lobbying group, essentially. Some library organizations also have lobbyists involved. They do pool training and bring in experts for library groups. But for collections, they operate a lot to do contracts. Some contracts like Hoopla, Overdrive, Ancestry Plus, different, those are specific ones in my area. But while it is possible for each library to get a contract to Hoopla, for example, Hoopla is happy to work with the consortia to do the contract because they know that they only have to create a contract with one single agency. And then the agency, the consortia in this case, have to agree that there's going to be X number of people, X number of libraries that join in on Hoopla and offer Hoopla services. So while the consortia does the contract, the individual libraries, which are already a member of the consortia, can say, we want to take advantage of Hoopla, as an example, and they get a good price individually on Hoopla because the contract is through the consortia. Hoopla will negotiate and talk to each individual library, knowing that the contract is covered through an organization like the consortia. Overdrive is a common one because what happens is Overdrive electronic publications in that individual library members of the consortia can get together and dictate to some extent what type of materials are going to be through Overdrive. And then in addition to Overdrive, there's a program called Overdrive Advantage. And while Overdrive is shared, in other words, there's one book that is shared by all the different libraries, Overdrive Advantage says that each library, a specific library, can order certain of the electronic publications to be reserved for their own patrons. Ancestry Plus, of course, is the library version of Ancestry. But let's take Hoopla. The difference between Hoopla and Overdrive, Hoopla allows for any electronic publication. Of course, Hoopla is more than just books. It's books, audios, comics, streaming movies, different things, whereas Overdrive tends to be books or audiobooks. But Hoopla will allow any person to use something that's on Hoopla. Each person has access to everything on Hoopla at any time, whereas Overdrive tends to be shared. But the contracts that go with consortia are very helpful in terms of developing electronic materials that can be shared. Now, consortia also has in their writings, in some areas like mine, libraries have to lend from one library to another within the consortia. And some consortia do that. Other consortia say the aspect of electronic library sharing is sufficient to handle the consortia is for there. Now, when you're talking about other states, there's going to be different state laws related to consortia. And what I highly recommend, and we'll talk about laws in a little bit later in the class, but you look at consortia in your state and how consortia is handled and how consortia is funded. I can talk about specific states, but I can't talk about every state. So the basic premise of consortia is to share library services, primarily public libraries in consortia. So what you got is you got shared collections, either in multi-branch systems or libraries across areas, often shared collections in terms of regional libraries. You've got cooperatives, which tend to be any type of library, but originally started with a lot of libraries that wanted to use the OCLC services. And then there's consortia in terms of the way it's handled with different libraries. A lot of this information, a little more generic, will be in books. I've talked about some of the things I talked about are specific to what I know in terms of state laws and funding, but the book will talk a little more generically about the topic. Thank you very much. Remember, any questions, virtual office, email, and discussions. With the discussions, I may ask a specific question on the outset, but remind you, while you may work on answering the question that I ask on the outset, the discussion is a free-ranging topic, so that any topic, any questions you have, anything that you want to bring up, you can bring up in the discussion. Thank you very much.